Alright, here's a video on Pyrrho that I've wanted to make for a while now. I want to describe what I mean by the poet-philosopher. Now, I'm not necessarily claiming I'm a poet-philosopher. I'm pretty analytic, so that'll be a separate issue if it's an issue at all. But first, I'll give you the context. I've used this term loosely, and the definition I'm going to give is a pretty loose definition. And I've used this definition figuring usually people that are exposed to Western philosophy kind of, would know what I meant. But I use this in a comment to Azranok, who was talking about how he would like to see the end of philosophy, or philosophizing in some sense. And I asked if that included the poet-philosophers. Now, I think he might have been able to guess what I meant, but it wasn't clear enough to him. He didn't want to guess, I don't think, so he asked me what I meant by that. And I realized that this is something that I have to explain. So let me go get a scotch, and I'll be right back, and I'll explain it. Okay. So I told you that because that sets up the context. I mean, one, this is an answer to Azranok, but not really. This is a general description, but that context is important because the question was about the ending of philosophy. And to me, that's impossible, and it's related to this definition. Okay, first of all, I think the best way I have to explain this right now is through another idea that I have of the pair of philosophies, that I call the pair of philosophies. The point is that with the pair of philosophies is that everybody, that all philosophers have at least two philosophies. One is the one they tell you, and another one is the one that you can deduce from their behavior. Okay, so that second one is the philosophy they would have to have in order to believe in their own behavior or justify their own behavior. Okay. Now, this second one is all about the person's worldview as they act on it. So philosophy, among other things, is about worldview. Somebody's philosophy is their view of the world, how they interpret the world. And everybody has one of these. Everybody has a worldview. So philosophers may have at least a pair. People that don't ever think about their own philosophy or put it in verbal terms still have a philosophy. What is it? It's the same one, the second philosophy that you can deduce from someone's behavior, or for that matter, for any animal's behavior, right? I say a tick has a parasitic philosophy. Anyway, we all have this model, and it's really worth mentioning how present this model is. I mean, if I say worldview, a lot of people will understand what I'm talking about, and will think of this little model of the world that we have, that we use. But it's more than that. Because, for example, we think we're immersed in this three-dimensional world. This seems like a three-dimensional object right here. And yet, we know that this is all recreated through the senses. I don't have a three-dimensional eye, I have a two-dimensional eye. I have two two-dimensional eyes. I deduce the three-dimensional information from parallax, from shading, from color, and then I recreate this model. This is the worldview. And it's not something that we look upon from outside, looking down. We can do that. We can have a little miniature version of our model and think of it that way. But we're also inside this model. We recreated this model, and then we put ourselves inside it, and we're in the middle of it. And it seems confusing to people because, wait a second, this really is here. Does Pyrrho think that this isn't here? No, I think this is here. But I know that I'm experiencing a model that I have of it anyway. It's like if somebody paints a painting of a coyote. We don't have trouble. I mean, the coyote was really there, and yet the picture is still a picture of. If somebody takes a photograph of the coyote, we're not confused then, right? We know that the picture is a picture of something that was real, but that the picture itself is an image. That's what we're experiencing. We're in the middle of this imagery that we have recreated, a virtual reality that is created by us based on the sense input that we have and our other ideas that we use to combine all this sense input. And then we actually place ourselves in the middle of this. Okay. So everybody has a worldview. Now, the mainstream of Western philosophy is very analytic, trying to see, hey, can we reduce everything in the universe to first-order logic? Can we reduce this to something very comprehensible that yields to proof? And so traditional Western philosophers look down on flowery language and illogic and a lot of these kinds of things. Well, you could say I look down on those things as well, but the point is this. The poet-philosopher realizes that a lot of things go into creating an actual worldview. I mean, it's one thing, these worldviews that the philosophers express to you. Then they live another way. The way they live, the real worldview that they have, always involves, metaphor, and it involves irony and contradictions. And the poet-philosophers are the ones that accept that. They take into account, they're looking at worldviews in the broad sense, and they're taking into account everything that goes into the worldview. So from you might have heard me say, for example, before, that to me, illogic, all the illogical ways of thinking are also kinds of logic, in the sense that logic is really any way of working on concepts and ideas. People use illogic. So a poet-philosopher has this to deal with. A traditional analytic philosopher, traditional in the West, can and often does ignore all of these other elements because those other elements are unworthy. So given that, a poet-philosopher is a lot more free to use metaphor, to use art, to use irony, to use an artistic way of expressing their opinion. So the poet-philosopher can say something like God is dead, and that can have a meaning even though that they're atheist. They never thought God lived in the first place. And yet there's meaning in that. There's metaphorical meaning. There's a lot of meanings that can be unwound out of that idea. God is dead. And the thing is that this is also part of something that has literally to do with poetry, that I think of as the poet's revenge, which is the poet's main tool is metaphor. Well, this analytic tradition of philosophy has looked down on things like metaphor as just flowery prose, but it turns out in cognitive science that it looks very much like we all use metaphor to think. All of our thinking is metaphor, all the way down to you can call space and time, comments about space and time literal, but even within space and time there are lots of metaphors. And so this to me is like the poet's revenge, because it turns out something that was only really embraced by the poet philosophers is really a part of all thinking, all cognition, and therefore all philosophy. So to me, it's very brave of these kinds of philosophers, because they might talk about something like love, which cannot be reduced down to an analytic analysis, at least not entirely. But they go ahead and they'll look at things like this. They'll look at illogic. They look at things that motivate actual human beings. They'll look at emotions. That is something that the poet philosophers will do. Basically, the poet philosophers are just anybody that is willing to recognize more than merely the analytical truths. So I hope that explains it a bit. Now, am I a poet-philosopher? Probably not. I think I'm pretty analytic. But then again, maybe I am, in the sense that I do take these other things into account. But I tend to address them pretty analytically. I'm not the kind of philosopher that's going to come up or wants to come up with a statement like God is dead. I'll probably try to have something more analytically, meaningful. But then again, I do like the poet philosophers, and they're the ones that usually have the truths that I agree with. And I do have an artistic side where I embrace that kind of thinking fully. So anyway, that's the poet philosopher. Take care.